contributed more than 30 papers to professional journal and published 2 books, Competing Through Knowledge, Building a Learning Organization, that is from Sage Publication, and another book is Understanding Organization, that is from Prentice Hall of India. Sir's latest book is on social enterprise, which is published by Sage. And this is the only book in India which is recommended by all the institute who are teaching social enterprise, social entrepreneurship. And the very special thing which I found that no one has developed that typology and taxonomy as Sir has developed. And I have also quoted the taxonomy and typology in my book with the reference of Sir. And that is very, very clear typology. And I think all of you will enjoy the lecture and the sharing of his knowledge during this lecture. Sir, over to you, sir, for
Thank you, Dr. Pandit. Thank you very much for the introduction. I would just like to make one clarification that this introduction is of my previous avatar when I used to work with the corporate sector, which I stopped doing almost 15, 17 years back and moved into the social sector. So currently I work only in the development and social sector and more focusing on the social entrepreneurship and rural livelihoods. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure and also very heartening to see that social entrepreneurship as a field of, academic field has started taking shape in India. And I mean, now we have FDPs which are totally focused on social entrepreneurship. And we have, I mean, many academicians who are working in this area. So thank you very much for this. And so what I'll do in this, I think we have time till 3 o'clock, which is about 70 minutes. So what I'll do is to describe typology, which I developed based on, let me give a little bit of background that I moved into this sector around 2004, 2009 to 2017. I used to organize a national conference on social entrepreneurship, which primarily focused on not the academic conference, it was a practitioners conference. So had the pleasure and privilege of interacting and knowing and then even visiting their ventures for more than 200 social entrepreneurs, young and old, well-established, those who were just starting up, many people who were part of the ecosystem of social entrepreneurship. And so the typology is based on the stories which I heard, the ventures which I visited, and somewhere, one started looking at that, especially in India, which the field is much more diversified, although less documented, and perhaps that's where conferences like this also make a difference. So very quickly, our agenda would be this, that I'll start with the working definition of social entrepreneurship. I always say that social entrepreneurship is a term in search of a definition. So we talk to 10 different people and you will get 7 different definitions. So we'll start with the working definition and also focusing more on what is the entrepreneurial, because much of the discourse and discussion on social entrepreneurship focuses more on the social than the entrepreneur part. And even when we talk about the entrepreneurial part, we often confuse it with, startup and starting a small business, which is not what, if we go to the classical literature of Schumpeter and Jean-Baptiste Say or Peter Drucker, entrepreneurship is more than just starting a new business. I mean, many businesses are entrepreneurial, young businesses are entrepreneurial, but not all the new businesses are entrepreneurial. So we look at what entrepreneurship is about, and that is where the opportunity identification, solutions, etc. One will talk about. Also, we'll focus on, because that by the very definition, we are social entrepreneurs solve social problems, and social problems differ from region to region, society to society, community to community. So there is a contextual embeddedness of, how, and that's how social entrepreneurship expresses or manifests itself. And the typology is a way of, identifying a few types. There would be, I'm sure, many more types. We'll spend more time on the fivefold typology, which I'll be sharing with you with some examples as well. And somewhere in the process, we'll also be looking at the meaning and types of scaling, because each of these types have different meaning of scale. I put this, social impact, scaling of social impact, that one very basic difference between a commercial entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur is that commercial entrepreneurship looks at scaling of the enterprise, whereas social entrepreneurs look at scaling of the social impact. Scaling of enterprise may be one way of scaling the social impact, but there are many other ways which we'll also be somewhere touching upon as we go through these fivefold typologies. As Nishaji mentioned, yeah, this is based on this is actually one full chapter in this book, which came out last year. Actually, almost exactly about a year back. It came out in January. So you'll find more details and about these issues in the book also, in case you are interested. So what is the working definition? So when I started looking at what the definitions, so there are, social entrepreneurship is not a term which was coined by academics. Social entrepreneurship was a term which was coined by, first time by Bill Drayton, who founded Ashoka, and then to the foundations and those who recognize social entrepreneurs. And then somewhere in 1998, Greg Dees wrote an article, The Meaning of Social Entrepreneur, which is a very classical article, which you'll find on the. So first time an academic, Greg Dees was a professor in Duke University, Fuqua Business School, and he wrote about that. So what I did was, because I said, like there are different definitions. So I looked at about 30, 40 different definitions, which, which are from foundations, from the centers, which are in different university centers on social entrepreneurship, etc., and academics, etc., etc. And so there were differences, but there were at least three commonalities. And that is what our working definition would be. The first is that social entrepreneurs solve critical social problems. So the very purpose of social entrepreneur is solving social problems. Just wait. Is solving social problems. That is where they differ from other kind of entrepreneurs. The second is that they solve these social problems by developing and implementing innovative solutions. The underlying part of the innovative solution. Innovation is a key aspect of entrepreneurship. So while there may be social, there may be problems which are existing, and there may be suboptimal solutions. But what social entrepreneurs do is to bring a more innovative and much more efficient solution. Like, for example, it's not as if the poor were not getting loans. They had access to loans, but they had access to loans from suboptimal sources like your money lender or from friends and families, etc. What microfinance or what Grameen Bank did was to come out with the innovative solution, which would make a greater impact in the lives of these people. So the innovation is an important part. And third, that they use entrepreneurial strategies. And that's why I said we look at what is entrepreneurial. That by itself can be a full lecture by itself. But if you look at, as I mentioned, that entrepreneurship is more than just establishing a business. Entrepreneurship is, so if you look at, the classical literature, where entrepreneurship was defined, the first person who talked about it was a French guy called Jean-Baptiste Say, almost 2-3 centuries back. But then it was Joseph Schumpeter who brought it into the economic theory. So Joseph Schumpeter's insights were based on the time when industrialization in America was happening, and he found, new kind of economic actors who were creating value. And so, and then later on, there were others like Johnson, like Peter Drucker, et cetera, who contributed to that. So if we look at what these entrepreneurial strategy, what is it that distinguishes an entrepreneur from other economic actors? One is this, that entrepreneurs, whether social or commercial, they identify a gap, they identify an underserved market, and then innovation as I mentioned, and implement a sustainable solution to meet the needs of that segment. So they may identify, for example, that people need energy, but energy is not available or not affordable. So how can one? And these markets are not only of consumers, these markets are also those of producers. So they may find that we have a large number of people who are skilled but are in informal sector, but they waste a lot of time looking for a customer. So how do you create a platform like where they can directly get connected to the customers, which is your Urban Clap and others, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of. So they identify underserved market, they identify a gap, a niche gap in the market, and then so this is one part that they are serving an underserved or less served or unserved market. The second part is that how do they, because we all say that entrepreneurs create value for the society, they create wealth for the society. Mostly it is just interpreted, okay, if I put up a venture, I employ 10 people and that's the value which I've created. But it's more than that. What entrepreneurs do, and that's where the innovation comes, is that they shift the socio-economic resources out of an area of lower yield or productivity into an area of higher productivity and greater yield. Just to give an example, and what an entrepreneur would do is that here are rural artisans, very skilled, making very fine needlework, applique work, or maybe metal art or tribal paintings, etc. But it doesn't create value because in the local market there is no value. So they shift those to those areas where it can fetch greater returns for the producers. It would have greater value for the customer, and therefore increase, or with slight polishing, that we have so many semi-educated rural youth who lack any employment opportunity or any livelihoods. So whether they can be connected to an industry, they can be connected to livelihood environment, or they can be trained to start their own ventures. So a rural youth, a rural girl who was educated but can't move out of the rural areas, with slight polishing, slight training, capacity building, can become a beautician in her own village, and suddenly the value goes up. So when we talk about what is entrepreneurial in social entrepreneurship, this is the entrepreneur. This is what, and as we look in the examples in the typology, you will find that these two themes, these two strategies keep on repeating. Now, if you look at the working definition, one thing is very clear, that when we talk about social problems are embedded in a society. But the social problems which India has are very different than the social problems which, say, developed markets would have, or the social problems which sub-Saharan region would have would be very different than, say, the social problems which may exist somewhere else in the world. So it is embedded there. Similarly, if you look at the innovative solutions, the innovations are rooted in the available resources, opportunities which exist in a particular segment, particular society, particular community. Similarly, entrepreneurial strategies, as we saw earlier, that what is less valued when we say shifting resources from less valued areas to higher yield areas, what is less value to what is higher yield would differ from society to society. So therefore, when we talk about social entrepreneurship, it is essentially embedded in the local context, the socio-economic, political, cultural ecosystem. So, and that's the basis of these typologies, which I'll be sharing with you. This typology, that these 5 types, that since there are different kind of problems and since the environment in which they exist are different, therefore they also require very different kind of solutions. So the nature of social entrepreneurship or the nature of solving a critical social problem would differ from one socioeconomic, cultural, political environment to another, because different environments would have, different societies would have different enabling factors, different, hindrances, and so on and so forth. So what we'll do is to look at these 5 types, and I'll describe. One are the local change makers. These exist in thousands, but these are the ones which are the most neglected in documentation, study, focus of social entrepreneurial efforts, whether academic or by foundations or award-giving agencies or funders, etc., etc. So we look at that. Public goods provider. Public goods are basically, the basic goods, basic needs. For example, government is the public goods provider when it provides health, education, etc., etc. But there are still niche. So ideally, government should be meeting all the needs, or sometimes NGOs do. But there are always niche which are basic but are not considered basic. And there are scalable models, which we'll see, highly impactful models, which exist. And there are many people in India who are doing that kind of social entrepreneurship. The third is this, which is what, now we have started equating with social entrepreneurship. These are the for-profit social enterprise. We say, earning well while doing good, etc., etc. In the typologies, this is one kind of social entrepreneurship. There would be many. There are many. There are at least 4 other different kind of social entrepreneurs which also exist. So we look at that. Then the social transformers. Many of the problems are rooted in the very structure, the systems of the society. They cannot be solved by tinkering with the symptom. So somebody has to change that system itself. The way the society, the legislations, the structures, societal structures function, and those are the social transformers. And then there are the ecosystem builders these are the ecosystem builders for the social entrepreneurship. So since it's an emerging field in India, there are any sector develops when there is a vibrant ecosystem. These are the people, these are, the service providers, these are the consultants, incubators, funders, etc., or even talent pipeline creators. In India, we have large number of them, and you will be interacting with a few of them during this course. Also, I was looking at the schedule. But these are also, these are also social enterprise, social entrepreneurial ventures by themselves. So we'll look at these 5. So let's start with the first one, the local change makers. As I mentioned, that some examples I'll talk about. These are relatively small localized ventures. For Protsahan, for example, is a very small organization which works very impactful work in a slum in Delhi, started by a young girl at the age of 25, 26, about 10 years back, Sonal Kapoor, and works with, in rescuing, rehabilitating at-rescue girl children. So they have, but what they have done is, now they work with a few thousands of them, created homes, shelter homes, where they get educated. Many of them now have gone into graduate. They are doing graduation. It's a small problem. It's a small, small venture, but it is making an impact. When we say, social entrepreneurship should change the world, it may not change the entire world, but it changes the world of these young kids. Proto Village is a very interesting, I would say, experiment which was started by Kalyan Akipedi in a small village in Anantapur, where he's an IT guy who decided to do that how can we create a fully self-sustaining village, which is, so they have a fully self-sustaining village which grows their own their own food, have their own energy, solar energy. They have their own schools, and now the people who go to visit to identify, to find out how they've been able to achieve it. So these are relatively small localized ventures. Many of rural public health ventures like Jamkhed project in Maharashtra, JSS in Chhattisgarh, Ekjut, which works in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. These work in relatively small areas, but what they have done is to create models of social change which can be replicated. So they focus on, because these are problems often which are so localized that they are considered to be too small for either the government schemes, which creates one kind of solution for everyone, or even by funders or investors, because they are seen as too small. But somebody has to solve them. And so in India, actually, as I mentioned, these are the neglected part. These are people who so they use local knowledge and resources, and they scale deep. When I mentioned scale deep, that scaling, they move from one level of needs of the community to another levels of the need. So, for example, when Protsahan started by only by rescuing and rehabilitating. These kids should have a home, but then they said, okay, they also need education. So they created their own five level creative, educational model, which was not only educating them in functional skills, it was also building their confidence that these kids can, because they were all traumatized kids. These are 12-year-old girls who are being sent to brothels, those kind of kids. So it also built their self-confidence. They acquired new skills like photo. Some of them do amazing photographies, make small video films, which for others, and so on and so forth. So that is scaling deep or scaling out, where they create models like Proto Village, which can be replicated elsewhere. I'll give you an example of Sebayan. Sebayan is a very interesting. It's a small NGO in Sundarban. Typical NGO. They do all kinds of small things. Thoda sa rural energy, thoda sa agriculture, little bit of some, and they get some government grants for local government grants for that. But they have one very interesting project called Jetty project. So this island is cut off from the mainland. It used to take about 4 or 5 hours to reach the mainland. So you had to travel from one island to another island to another island, and which would take 4 or 5 hours, which meant that the economic opportunity or social opportunities for the local population was very low. Local produce, which is fish and vegetables, could not be sold in the mainland so that they can get better value, or local youth could not reach the mainland in time to avail the job opportunities which were there. So what they did was to use the Shramdan, or voluntary labor, and created a jetty, which meant that suddenly now ferry would come to the island, and the distance or the time which used to be 4 hours plus now got reduced to 20-25 minutes. Very nominal charges of 1 rupee or 2 rupee per trip one way, but it was enough to generate revenue which would take care of the operational costs, as well as it created surplus. So the surplus was used. They hired a local old man who would sit in this hut to collect the fare, and there would still be surplus, which remain, which would be used for repairing the jetty. So what they had done was they created completely self-sustainable venture. And this is the kind of innovation I was talking about. Like what they did was to identify a gap, they created a new solution. The gap was that so much time takes, they created an innovative solution that this is how it can be done. And it is a sustainable venture and a solution. So when I was saying that, I mean, and these are, nobody would look at Sabayan for as a social venture. Nobody would go there. But what you would find if we all know, for example, some person in a locality, in a slum, or somebody in a village who's doing some phenomenal work in changing the lives of those people in a very sustainable manner. So these are the local change makers, which are also social entrepreneurs, but we often don't talk about it. Many of these local change makers later on become much larger. So they all start as local change makers, by the way. The second are these, the public goods providers. Public goods provider provide those basic needs which are services which are neglected. They're critical but widespread. So I'm sure many of you will be knowing about Goonj by Anshu Gupta, who collect, the urban discard, mainly the clothes, sort them, repair them, and then use them as currency in the rural areas for building rural infrastructure. Now, clothes, Anshu always used to say, like when we say roti, kapda, makan, there is focus on the roti, there's focus on the makan, but there's hardly any focus on the kapda. And more number of people die during the winters in places in the northern India or many other places during the winters due to lack of clothes rather than because of anything else. So this is a neglected need. Similarly, Pratham talks about the basic education, toy bank, Bombay-based Shweta Chari, who said that, toys are a very important, part of growing up. That's how we learn many of our analytical, social, emotional skills. But nobody talks about it. When we talk about education, toys are the least, they are not considered to be part of education. Green Souls, which is again a Bombay-based organization, which refurbishes the old shoes and distributes them, and also have a cross-subsidizing model. They also sell them to take care of some of the expenses, because a lot of people need shoes and they don't have shoes, they don't have footwear. We'll talk about Gyan Ki libraries, which is a very amazing initiative in Maharashtra, in fact now in 8 states. So these are needs which are what is innovative is the innovation in the one, identification of the opportunity, identification of the problem, and the mode of delivery. So for example, Toy Bank, they have some, I think, 700-800 toy banks across Maharashtra and many other states. But then the way they work is not toy bank per se. It is toy banks in each of these locations. So there are local partners who are semi-autonomous, toy bank provide, but they also provide the modules and how kids can learn socio-emotional analytical skills through the toys. Focus is on scale and sustainability, and Gyan Ki will look at an example. So Gyan Ki Library is started around 10 years back in Maharashtra, in Pune, by a guy called Pradeep Lokhande, who was an entrepreneur even earlier, but he went to some village, his own village perhaps, and he found that there is a rural school, but there is no library. And even if there are books in some schools, those are all the textbooks, and those are not the books which kids. Those are not the books why we became interested in reading. We became interested in reading because we had nice books, colorful story books, something which was more interesting. Therefore, we started, saying, okay, books have some value. So kids need those things. So initially he said, okay, why can't we create a library? He went to the market. He identified about 150 books, a set of 150 books, which which were, about life skills, which were about stories, which were about nature, which were about biographies, all kids books which would be for 6 to 14-year-old kids, interesting books. And the whole cost came to around 5,000, 6,000. So initially what he did was he said, okay, let's generate some funds. He asked for people for funds. What was interesting was, what was the innovation was that every book would have a postcard. So let's say if I say, okay, I'll fund one library, I'll give you 6,000 rupees. Every book would have a postcard with my address. And when the child reads that book, the child would scribble some notes, what he liked about the book, or just thank or something, and then would post the, that postcard. So when the donor got that postcard, the donor became an ambassador of the library and would talk about others. Why don't you people also do that? So that's how it started. This was the first one. They became larger. Recently, now they have come up with another. So then the other initiative, another change, which is that, okay, who can be the donors? Now every village or every library at least serves about 5-6 nearby villages. These are established in the schools. Every village would have 1 or 2 people who did well and have got better opportunities, and they are somewhere in the city. So he said, okay, there are these non-resident villagers, and they would have enough surplus income to fund one library. And most likely these are people who studied in the same school, so there is an emotional connect. So that's how they started identifying, writing to those people, and those people are more than happy. Okay, in my school, I'll establish a library. That was the innovation. Now they came up with these hampers, which are 6 feet by 4 feet. It's about 113 books. I mean, now from 150 it has come to 113 books. And then there are many, local organizations which say, okay, we will do it for the school. Now, if you look at the scale and sustainability, this is the world's largest rural reading program. More than 1 million students have been reached within the last 10 years, more than 1 million books, 5,000 plus libraries. This way within the last 2-3 years, the scale has grown up. So now almost every day, 2 to 3 libraries are being established. So, when we talk about the scale, the impact, here's the thing, but it's not a for-profit venture, but it's a sustainable venture. They found a way in which funding can be sustainable and impact can be made. So this is the second kind of social entrepreneurs. The third are, as I mentioned, the regular social enterprise, or in my book, I have called them constructive opportunists. So these are for-profit ventures with a very clear social mission. Most companies say that, most companies say we are concerned about the society, etc. The difference is this. The difference is that when they say that our mission is to make an impact on the society, they measure the impact which they are making. Selco, for example, I'm sure many of you will be knowing, it's the oldest solar energy enterprise, 1995, the first actually, by Harish Hande, which started in 95, and with the purpose of providing solar solutions to marginalized communities, to slum dwellers, villagers who don't have access because of the last mile problems. It's a private limited company, it's a for-profit venture, but the difference is that they measure the impact accordingly. They measure the impact not in terms of how many solar panels they sold. They do that also, they also measure that, but did the income of the person went up after buying that or not? To what extent did it go up? So that's the important part, which they customize it to the exact needs so that it becomes affordable. The innovation was that, a complete set of solar panels to, let's say, light up a two-room house may cost about 12,000, 15,000, 20,000. Now, the community they are dealing, the segment they are dealing, cannot afford 10, 15,000 rupees in a day at one go. So the innovation was to tying it up with microfinance. and cycling, recycling. So Harish Hande always say, my biggest lesson, which I learned, was from a street vendor. The street vendor said, sir, 300 rupees a month is very expensive, but 10 rupees a day is affordable. Let me repeat, 300 rupees a month is very expensive, but 10 rupees a day is affordable. You understand that point? That in the street vendor's income cycle, 10 rupees per day is something which can be, which he can use, because out of that he's getting a solar light and therefore saving on the kerosene lamp which he was using. But asking him 300 rupees at one go would not be possible. So those kind of things. Similarly, Milk Mantra, which is a large dairy project in eastern part of India, Odisha particularly. They measured the purpose for which Sri Kanwar Mishra started it was to increase because this is that region is a high milk producing region. But most of the milk goes waste. So the idea was that how do we increase the income of the dairy farmers? So when they measure the impact, they also look at whether the income of the dairy farmer increased or not just by their turnover and just by the profits which they make, which also they look at. Similarly, Rang Sutra, which works with the rural artisans, Jaipur Rug. Jaipur Rugs is actually the India's largest rug exporter, based obviously out of Jaipur. But Mr. N.C. Chaudhary started it in 1979 with the purpose of increasing the income of the rug weavers. These are the hand-woven rugs. So these are all done by the villagers. So now they work with around 40,000-50,000 rug weavers across India, provide them with design, capacity building, funds for working capital, etc. And then sell them in India. Large market is export market. So these are for-profit ventures with a very clear social mission. As I mentioned, the social mission is built into their performance management system. So they identify the opportunities just like others in unattended markets. And they have a potential to scale up because these are for-profit. Therefore, they are able to generate surplus, which they can reinvest to scale up, which means the organization can become larger. They can acquire their sources of inputs, or they can acquire the sources of their distribution channels, and so on and so forth. But one of the problems with these social enterprises, for-profit enterprises, what we call the mission drift. Because what they are doing is to balance their commercial objectives with the social objectives. Mission drift, sometimes the compulsions and sometimes even the lure of commercial success eats into the social purpose of the enterprise. And this has happened with many enterprises I know, where sometimes because they are growing, they get investors to invest. Now investors are looking for quick returns, and therefore they force them to move into those markets which was not part of their social purpose. So they are vulnerable to that. There is a very interesting, enterprise called Help Us Green, which is now called, renamed 2 years back as Pool. This was founded by two young guys, Ankit Agrawal and Karan Rastogi, Kanpur, based out of Kanpur. Because what they saw as an opportunity was so many flowers being dumped into the river, the Ganges River, Ganga River, from all the temples which were there. Now, if you look at any temple, one of the primary thing which is offered to the god is flowers. Now, those flowers are, because they're considered to be sacred, they are not sent to landfill, and they are generally thrown into the river. With the result that they also create a lot of pollution and sometimes, clog the river, create, when they, what do you call, sar jate, so then there are many things. They spoil the water, pollute the water, and so on and so forth. So they looked at that as a opportunity, that that is that second point of, low yield, something which is considered to be waste, can that be converted into a resource? And what they saw was this, that if these are the flowers, these flowers can be used as inputs to many other products. So they can be inputs to fertilizer, they can be inputs to incense sticks, they can be inputs to dhoop batti, and so on and so forth. And which is what Full.co does. They create some amazing products, and these are biodegradable. These are coming out of flower, and therefore they are valued. Or even when people do prayers and offers, so there is a market. That I am offering something which is biodegradable. I am offering something which is made out of flower and therefore pure. What they have so they got funding. They from Kanpur they have diversified to Haridwar and Varanasi and some place down south also. I'm forgetting, somewhere perhaps Andhra. What they have done also, that they were incubated. They had some idea that these flowers can be, these supposedly waste flowers can be converted to something else. So they approached IIT Kanpur and were incubated by that and came out with what is the, this is a thermocol. The substitute for thermocol, completely biodegradable, exactly the same properties and strengths, can be converted into various forms, and has a cost which is low, 25 to 50% lower than thermocol. So this is what they are working on. That's why it's like, they can scale up, they can diversify into other markets and so on and so forth. So social enterprises, as you will see, that they are for profit like any other for profit, but the success of social enterprises remains when they remain focused on the social mission, and when they are able to build that social mission into their performance management metrics. Otherwise, the chances of mission drift are high. There are ways also by which they because mission drift also happens because as the enterprise grows, initially there was a team, founding team of few members. Now you require more technically qualified people who can manage your finance, manage your marketing, who come from a very different background, who may not have the same social purpose, although they have the technical skills. So the role of HR in social enterprises is very important, which is in terms of selection of people who are technically qualified but also share the social mission, in terms of onboarding of those people, that how do you, even sometimes you may not get people with the right, right background or social experience and background. So how do you onboard so many of these ventures, I know like even Selco or Milk Mantra or Agri-Evolution Private Limited, that irrespective of where you are, which department you are joining, you will, the person, whether you are in finance or IT or MIS or whatever, or HR, 3 months you will be spending on the field so that you get to know the customers. You get to know what business are we in, what problems are we solving, so that later on that finance guy, when does the audit of some expenditure, knows where this expenditure is going and therefore has that at the back of the mind. So onboarding becomes an important part, and performance appraisal becomes an important part. That how do you appraise the performance, not just by the numbers in terms of targets, commercial targets, but also in terms of the meeting the social mission. So that becomes a important part, and also avoids mission drift to a certain extent. The fourth are these. They mentioned the social transformers. See, many of the problems which people face are so much rooted in the social structures, in the minds of people, in the way the society functions, in the way rules, regulations are made, that unless those structures change, you cannot solve the social problems. And it's very true actually for most problems in India, because in India, social problems exist layer by layer. But the initial problem, for example, which I may be attempting, is to increase, provide better school facilities in the rural area. So I start with the schools. But then soon I find that, schools are there, but the attendance rate is very low. Attendance rate is low because those kids also have some livelihood responsibility for their family. They have to, take care of maybe taking out the cows or harvesting and other kind of things. So, and therefore they miss out on the school. So I design a system by which they can be kept updated. But then I find that while kids are coming, but then dropout among the girl child is more, and which may be because of the social value, cultural values in the family or in the community that, once the girl is teenage, she should not be going out. Or it may be as simple as that there are no toilet facilities in the school. So 5 days during when they are in menstrual period, there's no place they can go, and therefore they find it very difficult to attend the schools. So there are layer by layer problems, and often these are problems which are embedded in the social system structures, regulatory policies, power structures of the society. And why it also happens is that because they affect those people who don't have a voice, who are not, like, for example, if you look at the informal workers, if you look at small marginal farmers, they are not collectivized, so they don't have a voice. I mean, if I'm in industry, I have a CII, I have a FICCI, I have a SOCM, I have a NASSCOM, who can influence, who can create white papers, influence the policies in favor of the industry, which would be favorable to the way this industry works. But small marginal farmers do not have a collective, and therefore they can't voice their concern. There's no way their voice can be reached. So these are based on the very structures. So unless one changes those structures, it would be very difficult to change the society or solve those problems. And most of these problems are those of social justice, economic, political, social. So how does one change that? How does one change the problems of manual scavengers? It's a big problem in India. In spite of having all the laws and everything, they still exist. It can be changed only when, not only the manual scavengers, but even the policy makers, the common citizens like you and me, they become part of the solution. When we say, no, this is wrong, this is what, and that is where the social transformation occurs. So what they aim is at the systemic change, the change in the institutions, in the cultural practices, in the regulatory systems, the social institutions, that unless those change, it would not be possible for these problems to be solved. And also institutionalize the change. So it becomes sustainable when, if you look at some of these examples on the right side, we look at right for information in greater detail. Because they institutionalized change. I don't know how many right to information we look at, right to education. Obviously, most of us know, being in the education industry, but education sector. But NASVI, National Association for Street Vendors of India, which is, which started in 1909 with the efforts of Ella Ben from Seva and Arvind Singh from Nidan, who's now the national convener also, who used to work with street vendors, and they found that street vendors always are cheated. Like there's no, street vending is a livelihood, but there's no vending zone. Now we have vending zones, which has started after 2014. that there are no vending zones where they can, so they always remain illegal. Wherever they go, so the police will harass them, they'll be shooed away, there'll be, corruption because of that, etc., etc. So they said, why? I mean, they should collectivize, and so National Association, which now has about 1 million odd members across all the states in India. They started with that. The idea, and it's not just for a lobbying. It's also that how do you train those vendors? How do you improve their sanitation habits? Many of them cook, or how do you provide them working capital finance? So they even have a microfinance organization which provides microfinance only to street vendors. So that came in the way they changed, that they lobbied, and they came out with white papers, publicized them, and worked with the legislators and policymakers, and finally in 2014 the Street Vendors Act of India got passed. It is a state subject, so there are states which have legislated it. There are states which are not doing, which is also where NASWI's Act. But that's the only way one could have created change, not by working with just a handful of street vendors. It had to be larger. Rugmark, I think many of you would know. What many would not know, that Rugmark was created by. Rugmark is the label of which ensures that no child labor was involved in creating these rugs. This was the work of Kailash Satyarthi, who also got the Nobel Peace Prize a few years back for his work with child rehabilitating, saving the children. But one thing which he did was to create Rugmark, which many people don't know his role, because he said that just by working with the rug makers, we can't change it unless there are also the exporters who say that we will not buy these rugs, unless the customers start saying that we will not buy rugs which are made by slave child labor. So Rugmark was created by bringing all these people on board. They worked with all these organizations, with European Union across the world, so that Rugmark, now it is called Goodweave, the name has been changed, but that's how the Rugmark label came into being. And so these are normally ideologically inclined because they are saying that a different kind of world is possible. So there is an ideology behind that. And there is an activism, but the only thing is difference in the activism is, for example, they also hold protests. They also, publish articles in newspapers, etc., etc. But the difference is the other part, that the focus is not on, meeting a few demands. The focus is on questioning the very basic practices, the system, and then institutionalizing the change. So let's take the example. Let me give the example of Right to Information Act, which I think was one of the watershed movement in Indian democracy in 2005. Unfortunately, now being systematically dismantled. I mean, started in 2005, but now it is. But anyway, it still works. So it started with very small, very small Mazdoor Kisan Sashakti Sangh, which was, founded by Aruna Roy and Nikhil Dey and Shankar Singh in a small place called, in a small district of Biwar in Rajasthan. I knew you in 1990, and they essentially used to work with small farmers and informal workers, construction workers, etc., to get them their entitlements. They need their ration cards, so to get the ration cards made, or they need their scholarships or pension which are due to them. Those which are. In 1994-95, what they looked at, they started looking at the corruption. That there's a lot of funds which would come, the government funds for different schemes, but were not being utilized, or not, somewhere. I mean, what happens is the corruption, they get siphoned off. So the innovation was the Jan Sunwai. Jan Sunwai, because what they did was they went to some of the government officials and said, okay, can we get the papers? How much fund they came? Some of them innocently gave them the papers. So they created these, large rallies over here, where they would read out, this much fund had come. It says that this place, a well was dug. And then people will say, there was no well. I mean, there's no well, or this place, the road was repaired. But I mean, people would say, no road. I mean, I live just there. Road is not repaired. But so that's how it started. That's how it started. But what it did was that the community, they suddenly got, they realized that having the information is a very powerful tool. We were getting exploited because we did not have information, so we need information. But transformation does not happen like that. Transformation happens when there are multiple stakeholders who get involved. So one thing which happened during these protests, one, local population also, because we're not part of the small farmers or the marginalized workers, etc. Who may be the local traders, but they also say, oh yeah, I mean, they are saying that this road in front of my shop was repaired, but nothing has happened over here. So they became part of it. In fact, during many of those protests, they would, supply them with food, etc. And so on. Local press, media became important. What the organizers did was to invite, because this news became publicized within some of the state media. So some of the state newspapers in Jaipur, Ajmer, etc. also published, this is what is happening in Bhiwar, which attracted many other journalists. Okay, what is happening there? There were some senior government officials who were in seat, or some were retired, who were well-meaning government officials who saw that this has been happening, and they say, okay, this is something which can be supported. There were other, civil society members, activists, lawyers, and organizers invited them and said, why don't you come and address these people, tell them what, how government functions, because they need to be educated about it. So that involvement, the multi-stakeholders, and then it became a much larger. The first draft of RTI, because Anna Roy was a civil servant before she moved into this. She was civil servant of IAS officer from 1968 batch, resigned in 1975, then worked with Bankar Roy, her husband, in Barefoot College, and then in 1983 she shifted to Bhiwar to work with the community by herself. But she had those old friends in the IAS community. So Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy of Administration, the IAS Academy of Mussoorie, they called for a consultation meeting, because some of our friends like NC Saxena, etc., or juniors like Harsh Mandar, who were at that time the director and deputy director of LBS Academy, and they called for a. So the first draft of RTI was created there, which was then circulated among other civil society organizations who also had similar kind of problems working with the community. Got some more. They involved the Press Council of India, and that's how the National Campaign for People's Right to Information, which was a large body which had different stakeholders. So there were senior journalists, there were civil servants, there were lawyers, there were retired judges like Justice Samant, etc. And the first draft was released by Press Council of India and Gandhi Peace Foundation, I think 97, 98, under the guidance of Justice Samant, and which was publicized because Press Council. So it was publicized, so people came to know this is what is happening. So there were legislators and state governments, and I mean what it did was, even before RTI came into being in 2005, at least 7-8 state governments had already created their own Right to Information Act. Delhi was one of them. One of the person who actually drove it is now the Chief Minister, got Baxis Award in 2006 for that work. He was, I mean, most people think that this gentleman came out of that Lokpal protest, but he was active on the ground since 99-2000, and there were others like Karnataka, Andhra, etc., who also came, and which led to Freedom of Information Act in 2002, which had some problems, and then the Right to Information Act in 2005. So if you look at this graphic, while it started as a small beginning, but the transformation could not have come by one person. One person may have played a more role, but when NCPRI, it became an agenda for everyone, for everybody who was involved. So social transformers have this capacity, unlike a common protester, of involving others. So one of the major challenges which social transformers have is to let go. Where they say, okay, it's not just my baby, it is everybody's baby. Where they fail also, where many of these social transformations efforts fail, where they get identified with one single person who's very dominant in that. Then last comes this, the ecosystem builders. So ecosystem builders, as I mentioned, that these are organizations which support social. They are not directly creating change. They are not directly solving problems. But what they are doing is they are helping those organizations which are solving problems, social problems. Many of them are also social enterprise by themselves. They are also social entrepreneurial efforts. So there are funding supports, impact investors, Avishkar, which was the first targeted fund for rural innovation, rural entrepreneurs, was and still is a social entrepreneurial venture. Now it has, of course, grown. Or lending platforms or investing platforms like Give India, Milap, Keto, etc., like that. Then you have pipeline creators who create talent for the sector. Of course, courses like what VS does or what TISS does, etc. Those educational courses are also part of that. But then there are also like Jagriti Yatra, and I think Asutosh is one of the speakers in this course, who's the executive director of Jagriti Yatra now, which is a train journey across India with about 400 youngsters, where they meet social role models, many social entrepreneurs, they work on their projects. About 35-40 social ventures come out of that 15-18 day trip every year, or Change Lumar program, or of Kaprava, etc., etc. So these are the pipeline creators. These are also the technical support providers. These are the incubators, advisories, consulting organizations, etc., and the disseminators. That the sector starts taking shape when people start talking about it. That's a very important part. Media and awareness among people is an important part which often we miss out. So you have these online publications like Better India, Optimistic Citizens, Weekenders, etc. And also you have now even mainstream media. Now I think Outlook Business stopped, but 2009 they started coming out with the annual issue on social entrepreneurship. Later on they changed the name to Good Business, but I think for almost about 8, 9, 10 years they came, and which were good issues. But a mainstream business media talking about social entrepreneurship. So then you find many programs like Young Turks and Amazing Indians, which feature social entrepreneurs. These are the disseminators, and so they support social entrepreneurial ventures. What they do is, what the function which they perform is this: that one, they reduce the learning curve for the new entrants, because they create a body of knowledge which, when I am starting, I have access to. There is there's a network of mentors who have gone through the same same rigmarole, have learned through their mistakes. Now those are available. So there are sector studies available. I want to do something in, say, rural energy, but there's a sector study which IntelliCap has brought out, which which gives me the complete picture of what are the opportunities, problems, supports, hindrances in rural energy sector in India. And therefore, they increase the efficiency of the system, the ecosystem, therefore, because the tie-ups and many of these also because, they create these partnerships and innovations. Conferences which happened, I know, because I used to do this national conference on social health, a lot of partnerships happened over there. These were practitioners' conference, so it was not just about the speakers. Many of the participants themselves were social entrepreneurs. And during the conversation, they would pick up, think, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is what you are doing, can we work together? And so that happens. Many of the incubators, they bring people together from similar sectors. They're being incubated at the same time. They have workshops together. There they learn, they find out what are the complementary strengths and weaknesses they have and where they can work together, and therefore they enable the sector. So these are the 5 different types. As I mentioned, that there would be, I'm sure, many more, but these are the ones which I could identify. The purpose of sharing this was that currently, if you look at the academic literature, if you look at much of the popular publications on social entrepreneurship, they are sort of straitjacketing the meaning of social entrepreneurship in India. So mostly it is the third type, the social enterprise we talked about. The others are not, they're not on the radar. If Gyan Ki library, if somebody even, it's I mean, if it meets all the requirements of social, it's solving social problems, there's innovation, and it's sustainable. But they would say, no, it's just an NGO effort. Whereas it is it's an entrepreneurial effort. It's not something which is dependent on, which is not sustainable by itself. So that's it. I think I'm well in time. So let me end with this. I think many of you would know the principle of equifinality. The principle of equifinality is a principle in ecology, which essentially says that there are many paths to the same goal. The purpose of sharing this typology was that there can be different ways in which a problem can be attempted, given the ecosystem in which it exists, and given the resources which and aspirations with the entrepreneur has. So thank you very much. I think we still have maybe 5 minutes in case there are any questions. Hello. अच्छा नहीं मेरा खत्म हो गया हाँ वो कुछ मैंने कहा कि कोई क्वेश्चंस वगैरह हो तो आई कैन आंसर इट जस्ट 2-3 minutes